last night the Bendigo Council met amid distant chants of Aussie, Aussie, Aussie by anti-mosque protesters. And yet the Statement of Australian Values, which must be signed by new immigrants, says that religious freedom is important. This feels like a parallel universe to what Australia are we living in?
Throwing it open like that. And the short answer to your question, of course, is that religious freedom is central to the Australian way of life. And so what type of Australia are we living in? We're living in one in which religious freedom is very important. It's part of the foundations of the fabric of our society. It is necessary as part of so many people's lives. And there is, of course, no monopoly on religion and who gets to have one and express one. So using notions of patriotism as the basis for limiting somebody's religious freedom if they are not doing harm to others is completely inconsistent with the Australian way of life. And I say that without reservation. But before we go through the details and all of that, I would of course like to thank you, Peter, very much for having me here today, to Ark Justice for putting this together, to the traditional owners to acknowledge their enduring connection to the land in which we meet and pay respect to their elders past and present, to acknowledge the Mayor. I thought I had a tough job. To Councillor Rob Campbell, who I haven't had a chance to meet yet, neither the Mayor either, I might say, but to pay respect to, unfortunately I have to say to the security guard, I'm sorry that you need to be here, but such unfortunately is the state of some of the discussion around these issues. But more importantly to all of you, just before we came here we were at the local high school, Bendigo High School, secondary school, and one of the Year 12 students put their hand up and said, what is one of the best ways that we can prompt change in our society? And there's of course a long-winded answer to that, but the summary of it is you need an engaged and educated citizenry. And you need an engaged and educated citizenry so that people stand up and speak out on issues from time to time, seek out new ideas, knowledge and information to inform their own decision making, to be reflective and considered, so that we can build a better polity to inform a better society and our better governance. And the fact that you've all taken time out on your Friday afternoon to come and talk, to listen to me, that in itself is a questionable judgment, but to come to engage in this discussion, I have nothing but admiration, and I don't know what perspective debate you're all on, but I respect it nonetheless. And really, if nothing else, that is the central theme that has to run at the heart of this discussion. How it is that we create a society where we have respect for each other's basic humanity, we tolerate each other, because we'll never work towards, and I would argue we shouldn't work towards a society where everybody equally accepts each other and their views, because there are things that we might all find objectionable from time to time or unacceptable. But that we have to have that respect for each other and respect our common humanity, because in the end that is the only thing that will bind us as a society in our shared purpose in making, in this case, this city great, our state a fantastic place to live, and our nation to be the beacon that we want across the world for the type of society that can fully realise everybody's individual potential and their contribution to make to themselves and the world and their community, and to improve the state of humanity. But I've got to say that as an outside observer, though I do come from Bendigo from time to time, every time I see the discussion around the development of a local mosque in Bendigo, it does fill me with a certain amount of sadness. I said to Peter when I arrived here that when I drive into Bendigo, I look at a town, and what I see is a town that is, like all other towns, has its issues, I'm sure. But nonetheless, to me, is a cohesive society where people seem to be getting along fabulously well and providing the type of community that we would all want for ourselves. And I just don't connect this discussion around heated opposition around the development of a mosque and attitudes towards some aspects of our community with Bendigo. It doesn't relate at all. And it always leads me very quickly to the conclusion that I don't think that a lot of the people who are involved in this debate are from within the community, Bendigo community. That isn't to say that there aren't some who, those against. Doesn't mean there aren't some who are not involved who are locals, and nor do I think that they should be silenced or censored in their view, and I think that it is a fundamentally positive thing that they're engaging in the affairs of the local area. But when it comes to the idea that the community of Bendigo is intolerant or has hostile views towards people simply because of their faith or where they were born or any other unnecessary attribute, it simply doesn't resonate with me. Of course, I don't believe that a mosque should be built, but nor do I believe that there should be something to stop it being built. If you believe in freedom and human rights as I do, you believe in everybody's freedom to go about living their life as they see fit. And from time to time, they'll collaborate and work together to do certain activities that they think advances their interests or their community's interests. Of course, lots of religious groups have done this over centuries. We have, of course, many other types of religious houses of worship in Bendigo and across our state and our nation that have been forged based on people's basic commitment to their faith and what they think is necessary to express that faith. And so long as they do no harm to others, there is simply no reason for the government to get in the way or deny them the expression of that religious freedom. But when you come down to a conflict like you have, or a difference of opinion, perhaps a strong and passionate one, we have to look at what the rights are that are involved. Of course, there are the rights of the freedom of speech of the protesters on both sides, those advocating for, those against, and those simply sitting in between saying we want a cohesive society. And everybody should be free to express their rights so long as they're not seeking to violate the rights of others. Of course, there is the importance of freedom of religion, and that people should be able to express themselves, both in the unlimited sense of their religious thoughts inside their own mind, but also giving the manifestation of them in their life. And sometimes that involves going and praying at houses of worship and associating with other people that may have a commitment to the same faith. But equally, there's an important human right, which I always call the forgotten human right, that is very much a part of this discussion. And it is property rights. Property rights are a direct manifestation of people's capacity to enjoy the benefits of their earned endeavours. And if somebody buys land in a system of government and economy that we have, they should be entitled to do with it as they see fit, so long as they're mindful of local laws and public amenity. And of course, we have local governments and regulations that deal with these things all the time. And there is no basis to turn around as the general community and impose a majoritarian attitude about what people can do with their land if they're not doing harm to others. And so, while there are rights on every side of the discussion, both those favoured and against, in the end I simply do not see the rational argument to be used where the council can go about imposing its worldview to stop the development of a religious house of worship. And there's of course the grand intellectual argument about rights and how they interact with each other. But it's something just much more practical. When it comes down to, in a liberal democracy, we have to recognise everybody's common humanity and enable people to go about living their lives if we expect that to be treated towards us. Once you sanction the principle that government can come along and squash some people's rights and the manifestation of their freedom, you in the end have to accept at some point in the future, when you are not part of the majority, that it will be done to you. Now, even religious institutions have a perfect track record on this. In fact, we were talking this morning again about the engagement of religious institutions in promoting some aspects of discrimination against people on the basis of their sexual orientation. And so when I hear a lot of people complaining that their religious freedom is being violated and they're now being treated as some sort of subclass or group, more often than not, my response is, I know it must feel very difficult to be vulnerable. It's just like how the rest of us have felt all the time. So there is no perfect answer. But if we focus on our common humanity and we focus on respect for each other, and that people should be able to go about living their lives in a free society, then of course we can expect exactly the same response when it is our turn and when we are not part of the majority, and when we want other people to respect us. And that commonly is referred to as a sort of live and let live attitude. I would argue it's the basic principles of classical liberal political thought and the very basis of our free society. Because in the end, we have to recognise that our society will only be held together while we respect the rights of everybody. When you have a society that seeks to impose majoritarianism on a smaller section of the community, it can only lead to a tyranny for some. Freedom, of course, has to be about freedom for everybody, and especially for those groups who are unpopular. And that, of course, is challenging, because there are different groups of people who are popular at different times, or unpopular at different times. Of course, the protesters against the mosque are, by and large, quite unpopular, I suspect, for a large part of this community. But they have their rights too, and they should be free to exercise them so long as they don't incite violence or direct harm against another group of people. And that's challenging, because they say things that some people don't want to hear. And yes, for some people it's deeply personal. But it's deeply personal on both sides. It's deeply personal for those who may be of Islamic faith who want a place of a house of worship. And the feeling that by not being able to do so, or that other people are interfering with that they are not just being disconnected from their faith, but they feel less secure in their society. But equally, sitting behind a lot of the motivations of the protesters is an equal fear of vulnerability and issues about their sense of security in society. And those issues need to be addressed. They need to be considered and they need to be responded to. Some of them, I think, are baseless. Some of them, I think, have no evidence, facts to back them up or evidence to back them up. But it doesn't mean that the best way to go forward is to silence or censor them or make them feel alienated or marginalised to the point where they can no longer express themselves. All that does is validate their views to themselves, reinforce them, and encourage them to keep going further. But what we can't do is junk the principles of human rights and freedoms in the process of trying to build a constructive society, which is why I think fundamentally the protesters are wrong. Because what they're seeking to do, more often than not, is reverse one of the most foundational principles of our society, which is to treat every single person who is Muslim as guilty until they are proven innocent, because they are concerned about issues of extremism, and particularly Islamist extremism, which is a very important issue, and something that we shouldn't shy away from talking about as part of our national conversation, our local conversation. But none of that is addressed by stopping law-abiding citizens going about their lives, doing law-abiding activities, practicing their religion entirely consistent with the values and the central principle of the Australian way of life, and fostering a culture where anybody feels marginalised. Because when you do that, you push people's behaviour underground. And anyway, if you've ever gone and spoken to the Australian Federal Police or lots of other different governmental agencies that engage with surveillance, will tell you that the places where Islamist extremism festers isn't in the bright light of day. It's when people aren't able to go about, or young people in particular, particularly young men, aren't able to find social engagements about issues of faith in legitimate mosques and amongst legitimate preachers and imams. When you stop people developing legitimate houses of faith, people go underground. And when they go underground, they become prey for people who want to use and abuse them for their own political or ideological or extremist religious causes. And it's at that point I have a real objection to a lot of what the protesters are arguing. They're actually feeding the problem they think they're trying to solve, not the other way around. If we believe in the principle of liberty, of course, everybody has to be able to have their faith and to be able to express their faith as they see fit. But that doesn't mean people are, of course, able to use religion as the basis in which they can commit violence against another person. And that doesn't matter what religion it is, and as I said, religion doesn't always have a perfect history in this space. If we want to address the fundamental issues of Islamist extremism that does exist in some parts of our country, and disproportionately, if you look at the numbers, to the point that people get radicalised, so they jump on planes and fly overseas and commit horrific committing acts of violence against other people or at risk of doing so and involving themselves in wars that have nothing to do with them. We need to provide alternative pathways for how people want to engage. We need to be investing in community infrastructure, and the main and the most important ally in that cause against that common enemy of extremism is mainstream Muslim Australia. If you go and look at the horrific crimes that are being committed by Islamist extremists across the world, Muslims are the primary target. There are lots of other targets too. And eventually, yes, if they're successful, our country might be a target as much as the other. But Muslims are the ones who have taken the most casualties. And we have a shared interest as allies to deal with these threats. But none of it is resolved by demonising or stigmatising a section of the community and denying them the capacity to go about their lawful business. If anything, it simply feeds into a radicalisation agenda that can be utilised by those who wish us and them harm to justify their arguments and prosecute their case. Mainstream Muslims are and will continue and will remain the greatest weapon we have and the greatest ally we have against these issues. We need to invest in the social bonds that ensure that people don't take fallen paths. And that isn't, of course, something that just applies in this situation. It exists in lots of situations in our community. But that requires working with allies and providing people legitimate places to engage with the types of religious practices that go about people living their lives so that they feel they're full participants and they're investors in our society. Because people become marginalised and distracted and go off and fight causes that have nothing to do with them when they don't feel any investment or commitment to our society. And if you want to fuel that perception, all you need to do is provide legitimisation for the idea that they don't have an investment in our community and that we do not understand them, or more importantly, that we do not welcome them. As a country going forward, we have to make a choice. Are we going to live up to the spirit of our nation, the important principles that underpin it, that are included in section 116 of the Constitution, that our society is one where everybody has the freedom of their religion and the freedom to practice it, and that through a system of governance that ensures that there is a mutual respect for everybody, we are going to take our country forward? Or are we going to create a society where majoritarianism rules and vocal minorities get to stand up and demonise certain groups of people to the detriment of everybody? Because, and I come back to the central thesis that I came to the start, which is an active citizenry is the only way that we can make sure that people are held to account for their behaviour. It is part of our responsibility, everybody's responsibility in this room, to stand up for those people who may be the victims of positions born out of a lack of understanding or ignorance. Because you, if you want to have investment in your community and taking it forward, have to have investment in other people's faiths as well. And when I look at Bendigo, I see that every time when I see activist groups standing up against the protest movements. But I always caution about doing too much activism in response to protests. Not because I don't believe that people shouldn't stand up and speak out, but that sometimes it can be counterproductive. Because not only does it legitimise the original protest movement through a counter-protest, but that can often lead, of course, obviously to conflict, which may lead to a security guard being necessary. But instead, perhaps looking at avenues that you can more productively engage people to express themselves to promote community harmony. And there are lots of different ways you can do that. And simply through weight of numbers and the message and the narrative of the whole of the Bendigo community getting together to talk about what is good about our society and what our common bonds are, delivers not just an immediate benefit and ensures that there isn't a focus back on those who are protesting, but a much clearer message about the type of values you want to project to the rest of your community, your state and your nation. And that by doing so, you actually bring people together rather than focusing on the point of conflict and division, which can create problems into the future. I'm going to leave my comments and challenging provocations, if we call that, from Peter, because I think it's always good to get people's diverse opinions. So throw it open to the floor.
Thank you, Tim. We've got a roving mic if people can't hear questions, but I suspect that we're going to be okay in this small environment. This is an opportunity for people to ask questions, not to make statements or lengthy statements, but to ask some questions, and anything's up for grabs. But I'm going to ask perhaps one of the most obvious ones in recent times, Tim, and that's about allowing certain people into Australia. You recently argued that Dutch politician and anti-Islam campaigner Geert Wilders should be allowed into Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
Okay. Why is that? Because I don't think the government should decide the opinions that Australians can hear. Secondly, because I think it's hypocritical to oppose his arrival in Australia. When it comes down to it, and I don't share, actually I'm sure there are some things I share with Geert Wilders, like everybody in this room would, but on the issues that he's known for, his primary argument is that migration law should be used to stop people coming to the country that he thinks disrupts social harmony. And that obviously in his particular context manifests that he thinks that Muslims are that case in Dutch society. So I think it's somewhat hypocritical to turn around and say we should use migration law to stop somebody coming to our country that we believe will create social disharmony. It's an utterly inconsistent argument, or a hypocritical one. But equally, as far as I'm aware, and certainly based on past experience when he has been here, he has not broken any laws, and he has not said anything that isn't otherwise entirely lawful for any Australian to say. At all. So I don't think we should suddenly use the power of government to decide the opinions Australians can hear. But equally, I think it's utterly self-defeating. A stable and a sustainable society, a socially stable society, is one that allows challenging views and thoughts from time to time. Well, allows them all the time, but most of us don't go out there to be deliberately provocative, although some people might pass and question otherwise. But that is a manifestation of people's genuine, deep-seated concerns when they say something controversial. And that by expressing it, it gets it out there, it vents it, and all the standard arguments around freedom of speech. But equally, a society, in order for it to survive, has to be able to adapt and change in circumstances. And the only way you get that is through robust dialogue. And so somebody like Mr. Wilders, who of course comes from overseas, we could decide to exclude him, but it's not as though his views aren't well held by some people within our country, and that there's any real public policy benefit in keeping him out. Least of all, the much broader objective about whether the government should decide what we can hear. And also because it's so self-defeating. The fact is, we could chuck him up here on the screen, on a live YouTube channel, and have exactly the same outcome, and probably just save ourselves a lot of money. That is the world we live in today, and one that is dynamic and constantly changes. And if we, and so it becomes self-defeating to simply exclude somebody. I realise a lot of people will think he causes social disharmony, therefore we should keep him out. But all of the issues that he wishes to raise are well within what is a legitimate discussion in a free society around migration law. There are other issues about domestic issues that occur in the Netherlands, but those equally are issues related to law. And so you shouldn't exclude him just because you don't like his opinion on some law.
Questions?
Yeah.
Noemi Cummings is my name. I've been in this country now almost 30 years.
Good.
I love it. And I always think when I don't like it anymore, I take off. I won't live in Barcelona. I'd be glad to. But, so when I hear, the government saying, you come to this country and then you go out and fight against the country,
Yeah.
we will remove your citizenship and so you can keep the other one. Somehow I have a tendency to agree with that.
Yep.
But I don't understand the opposite argument. Can you please tell me what is the negative about it? So if I don't like this country,
Leave.
I'll leave. But if I go and fight against it and then I keep my other citizenship from the other country, provided I have wrong about it if Australia does that?
Well, there are different dimensions to it. Firstly, it depends whether you've got dual citizenship or not, and there was an initial discussion about whether people could have their citizenship cancelled if they were a sole national. Now, I would strongly oppose that.
Where would they go?
Well, exactly. But that was at one point something was being discussed. And, you know, there's sort of grand international law arguments about the fact that you can't make somebody stateless. But in the end, we have to actually make a decision as a country about whether we're happy to just export our problems that have largely been created on our shores to the rest of the world, and really accept, to the extent we accept some responsibility for the people who are in our country and the conduct they get up to overseas. And so I don't think cancelling sole nationals citizenship is entirely justified.
I agree with that one.
Good. So we're already on 100%. Now let's go for 200. But in terms of the broader issue around dual nationals, it was predominantly not about whether you could cancel somebody's citizenship, but it was about the process to cancel somebody's citizenship. And I've got to say, cancelling somebody's citizenship is extremely serious. Most of our rights and privileges and everything that we attach to the value of our society comes from some form of citizenship. Certainly the full extent. And so what we shouldn't have is a degree of ministerial discretion about cancelling citizenship. And while I don't think necessarily the current immigration minister would have done anything inappropriate, and maybe the one after, and the one after that, once you legitimise a ministerial discretion to cancel somebody's citizenship, at some point in the future, you have to accept that it will be used. And at some point, it may be abused. And we need proper processes to make sure that when that decision is made, it is made with facts, with evidence, and there is some sort of decision of an independent body looking at the facts and weighting the evidence about whether that's necessary. And so the debate has always really been about how much can the minister make a decision versus how much can the minister make a decision off the back of a court decision or a criminal conviction history of some description, or that decision being made by a court. And my view has always been it is better for those decisions to be made by a court. There are other people who think that if you have a criminal record, the minister should be given that freedom to make that decision. But I consider citizenship so serious that really it's got to come down to the courts having some significant involvement in the judgment about the threat that person plays to remove somebody's citizenship. Now, in the end, it can end up with a sort of automatic process where if you have X crime, and then there's a cancellation, but it has to be serious, and the threshold test has to be set very high. But we need to be very cautious about going down this path, not just because once you validate cancelling somebody's citizenship as a legitimate policy response to a concern people have, that it doesn't take long before lesser offences can be used as the basis to cancel somebody's citizenship in the future. So that is the general reservation about going down that path. It's more about process. And it's entirely legitimate.
Got a question at the back.
Oh yeah, got two.
Yeah, you go.
Please.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation. I probably count myself as one of the people in the middle wanting a socially cohesive society. And I thought it was interesting, I think implicitly you were making the point that that journey to radicalisation can happen just as easily to English-speaking fifth-generation Australians, residents of Bendigo, as to Islamic citizens of Bendigo or anywhere else.
I don't think I was quite saying that, but that's right.
Well, okay. I think explicitly you made the point that anybody could feel like they're being trodden on by the majority, and I think the protesters against the mosque are expressing that. And okay, I'll make the point that I think the risk of radicalisation on that side of the debate is what we've seen, in the sense of feeling like their point of view wasn't being listened to and being vulnerable to radical racist forces from outside sort of recruiting them, basically. So, I mean, you obviously travel around the country and you're a very skillful speaker, but I wonder if you've been party to any more informal community-based discussions where community members were given that opportunity to express themselves and perhaps, I guess, tossed around over a cup of tea or a barbecue or whatever,
Sure.
and things have shifted.
So I do move around the country, and I have observed this is the first protest or movement against the development of mosque in Australia. There's been ones on the Gold Coast, Kalgoorlie. I'm trying to remember it, but it's a relatively common occurrence. And that's why I while disagreeing with the protesters and those opposed, actually give a lot of sympathy to their worldview. I don't have empathy, but I have sympathy. And I have sympathy because I do think it comes from a feeling of not having their views heard or properly listened to. And equally, that sitting behind it, whether you agree with it or not, is a sense of vulnerability and security. And their freedom to exercise and to express that definitely goes to the heart of people's sense of vulnerability and security. But of course that equally applies on the other side. Have I been a party to other conversations where people have had these discussions over barbecues? The answer is no. But I have observed the content that a lot of these groups put out. And I've got to say I'm not overly impressed with the substance or the narrative of the argument. Some of it is very hostile to people based on their faith or the faith itself. Some of it is about deep-seated fears of Islamisation of Australia, a position which I find very difficult to understand, but I can understand how... I can't really understand it, but people have different motivations and look at different reference points and look at different information than I do. But all that to me highlights is why people need to be able to express their opinion. But if you sit in the middle of this discussion and in the middle of this debate, and you self-identified for that, and it seems very difficult to me that leads you then, and I'm not in any way trying to project what I think your view is, because I understand what it means to be sitting in the middle, is how that can then lead to stopping the development of a legitimate house of religious worship. Because there are plenty of those for other religious faiths in this community. There are plenty of others throughout our nation of different faiths, as well as, of course, for that of Islam. And while there have been some issues in legitimate mosques, and we've seen that recently in terms of Parramatta, in practice, none of the substantive problems that may occur are resolved by pushing people to alternate sources. We have a problem with Islamist extremism. And some of that is rooted in an interpretation of religion. And a lot of people say, oh, we should talk about it more. It's like, I have no reservation in talking about it. But the greatest ally we have in defeating that is mainstream Muslims, because we need to draw a delineation between the insanity of extremism and what most people believe and how they go about living their lives, which is to be law-abiding citizens. We need to create, as a society, not just in this example, but every example, an opportunity for people to go about their lives lawfully and use that as the emblem or the beacon for which people can orientate their lives. And none of that is achieved by seeking to deliberately stigmatise a particular group of law-abiding citizens going about their life. But what it does do is fan the incentive, legitimise the attitude of those who would seek to radicalise some people. And of course, that's not the only example of radicalisation we have in our society, but it is the one at the centre of this discussion. Yes? No, the lady behind you was first.
I just wanted you to expand on the radicalisation point. I'm quite familiar with the polarising of... I've been sincerely unimpressed with the behaviour of some of the proponents of the mosque towards opponents, on the basis that many of them are quite discernibly the products of poor health outcomes, poor dental outcomes, and poor educational outcomes. And they are jeered at in terms that don't describe them in those terms. And that what we essentially have is a disaffected that does not respect the human rights of others.
Mm.
And we've got this huge debate going on about quite draconian laws relating to radicalising young Muslim youth.
Mm.
I'd throw the question open. It's buzzing lots of questions in my mind. I'm wondering what's going on in yours.
Well, lots of things going on in my mind. I'm not 100% sure I understand your question, so let me just repeat what I think you're saying, which is that there has been as much demonisation on both sides, or at least there has been demonisation, some demonisation, and belittling and negative attitudes towards proponents. And that does occur. This happens all the time in discussions where people have different points of view.
And this leads to the disaffection of the youth and makes them right.
Correct. And we see this in parallel debates where people are very quickly called bigots simply because they have a different point of view. As an example, lots of issues that may relate to different areas of social policy. So it's not an uncommon thing, it's not an unusual thing, and it feeds and legitimises their resentment. And yes, leadership plays a big part of that, and that's where everybody needs to rise to the challenge, which is why I constantly talk about the fact that we need to have common respect for everybody's humanity, we need to tolerate each other. We will never get to a point where we all accept each other, but tolerance necessitates that we treat each other with a great degree of civility. And when you see that conduct, it needs to be called out because it is just as lopsided and potentially ignorant as the alternative position. But when it comes down to issues of radicalisation, the best mechanism to deal with it is to make sure people have legitimate alternative pathways. Rather than having people just go into their constituent groups and become more sure of their perspective versus the alternative, which is why when it comes down to, for instance, protesters for and against, if the UPF says they can have a protest, of course in a free society they should be able to do so. If you organise a counter-protest very quickly, you lead to conflict. Versus the alternative of 10 streets down organising a community barbecue where you all focus on social, on what binds us as a community and why we should all get along. And so I think you should be looking at alternative pathways. I don't follow the day-to-day activities of the council, so you may already be doing this. To provide people with alternative pathways and to have a reference point of what's a better option. Because if you simply feed into the constant conflict, it will only push people into different camps and stop people being given voice for saying, I sit in the middle of this. I think there are concerns, and I may have concerns, but equally, I also believe that people have to be able to go about practicing their religious faith. And it's emboldening the centre ground. And it's a perennial issue because the centre ground and the middle ground is always normally silent in these types of discussions. To raise their voice and say, this is the standard and the tone that we expect in the rest of society. And when it comes down to it, that measured position is always more attractive if it's obvious. It has to be out there. And this is where leaders within your community, but yourselves, have to stand up and say, this is the tone that we are going to set. Because it's infinitely more attractive to the vast bulk of people, particularly with our cultural attitudes such as our nation, that we want to focus on broadly how we get along, because we can always see more in common with those who have a lived experience with us than those at points of division. This generally is like, yeah.
I think you made the point before that a lot of these, the United Patriot Funds, they're extreme right-wing.
Well, I didn't say that actually.
No, you didn't. I apologise.
I'd say a lot of the nationalists.
But one of the issues is that they don't feel they're being listened to.
Yeah.
And it seems to me as a practical question, they are so fanatical about their views, though the views appear to me to be, in most cases, quite irrational. Very difficult to argue with them or discuss with them because they say things like, the council makes the point, but they're corrupt. They've got vested interests. Oh, well, what about, look, the newspaper newspapers, you know, corrupt as well. They're in bed with the council, and then Blair Cottrell gets up on his Facebook page and says, we had 3,000 people at this rally. You know? Now, so my point is, it's very difficult to reflect and say, well, yeah, okay, we'll listen to you, because they're not listening to anything. So it's very difficult for society to, you know, get the message to them that, yes, we at least respect that you have a point of view. They don't seem to be able to.
I didn't say I need to stress this. I never said, and this is why I always come back to between tolerance and acceptance. We have to respect their common humanity, and we need to tolerate their point of view. You don't have to necessarily respect their point of view.
Okay, so
there are plenty of views that I don't respect. And I agree with you. You know, there are people who you will never persuade. You're 100% right. And that will also go on the other extreme end of the debate too. There are people who want a very different system of governance in our society. But there are a very small number of people, and they, if they base it in their religion, and they give life to the greatest fears of the UPF and others, but they are an equally small minority of people. And I don't think they'll ever be persuaded otherwise. That's why I say you've got to focus not on the points of division, you've got to embolden the centre ground to stand up and say, this is the community that we want. Because you'll never be able to get a lot of extreme positions to come back towards the centre ground. But you can embolden those centre ground voices. And there's always a ton load more people in that space to have that discussion. And to engineer that discussion and to engineer and embolden those voices to stand up and speak out. It's one of the things that we run programs at the Human Rights Commission on, is how to embolden bystanders to stand up about the standard they're prepared to walk past. And it is true that you know, in life the standard you walk past is the standard you accept as a general principle. The tone of that standard is often set by leaders about what they're prepared to say, and I think too often there have been national political discussions where people haven't been prepared to stand up against irrational and extreme voices. Though thankfully in our national life they tend not to be that prominent. But it has to come down to emboldening the citizenry to do exactly the same thing. So think about the avenues you're trying to embolden the middle ground, rather than trying to change the views of the UPF. Because when it comes down to it, they'll turn up and they'll protest periodically. There are issues of law enforcement and everything else, and involving the police to make sure that nobody's harmed, and you need to deal with those things. But it's the alternative pathways for everybody in the discussion, Muslim, non-Muslim, and just people who want to live in a safe community, who will provide people with the greatest way to move forward and show a path to those who are issuing voices about what people are prepared to accept. So I know that's unsatisfying, because we all in the end want everybody to agree with us. Or I always want people to agree with me. but it doesn't work that way.
The point of the question was more that we can't, you were saying they need to at least feel that they're listening.
Sure.
And that is the dilemma. I don't think that'll ever.
No, but the point about saying it, they need to feel listened to, is more about not blocking off avenues that they can voice their opinion. And that is always the temptation, particularly with people who you think you can't even reason with. Don't do that. It's not a healthy way forward. It only exacerbates the problem. Let them go and protest, but ignore them. When it comes down to it, every time there have been these types of protests, Parramatta was particularly egregious, where I got the flyer about how they were running a protest to, was it bulldoze the mosque in Parramatta? And I thought, well, this isn't going to go well. And then I think it was 6 people. 6 people! And I've only seen images of the protests you've recently had, and it seemed the police outnumbered both sides combined. Embolden the centre ground. Embolden the centre ground. All right, sorry.
Just we've got about 5 minutes. I can at least need 5 hands. Can I just have a quick show of hands and see who's there?
Yeah, why don't we go throw questions and then I'll just give you
So I'm not going to get through them all. So lady at the back, gentleman at the back, and lady over there. Sorry about the others. Keep it quick if you can.
Thanks for your talk, Tim, and thanks for coming to Bendigo. I just want to say I think Bendigo and our leadership here is doing a great job.
Good.
And And I'm really pleased that what I'm hearing is so consistent from the people here, and I think we have great harmony. What I'm interested in is your point about the tone we set around human rights and extending that out more at a national level. So what I'd be interested in responding to is, we're talking about radicalisation. I think we realise here we have a de-radicalisation problem about people who've been radicalised against the threat of outside religions or cultures. And I think we could work with that. We don't have the radicalisation of young Muslims here, but we live in a country where that has become increasingly a problem. What I'm concerned about is the human rights leadership taking a position on these things, because whilst we say act like it's a level playing ground and that for the last 100 years Muslims haven't been being, had their whole culture bombed and it's constantly being wrong. We have young people easily radicalised because no one is stating the truth about that. And I think, we have the same problem here about the mosque issue. We need some clear statements to people say it's great to protest, but it's actually an infringement of the human rights of the people who want to build a mosque. So I just think we need clear human rights leadership statements, and then we can sort ourselves out around them.
Sure, and that's precisely the point. If people are stopped doing what they want on their own land to give manifestation of religious belief, it is a human rights violation. In the same way that if you stop people protesting and expressing their opinion, it's a human rights violation. But none of these things are straightforward. It's good to hear that you think your community and your leaders are setting the right tone for the discussion, but it's not as though it's, as for most people, straightforward and clear. Human rights only sit within a context of values that Australians think are worthwhile. If I go around the country and just preach rights without a consideration of concepts of fairness, justice, responsibility and freedom, as well as rights, it will only penetrate so far, because rights are only part of a broader discussion we have in our community about what we value. And so, yes, you can make a very firm principle about the rights discussion, but it's not the sole basis of it, because there's a point at which people's rights and the exercise of their rights can violate either the rights of others or other important principles as well. So,
gentleman back, just quickly.
Yeah, sure. I guess my question is, how far should we go? It does feel like there's emphasis on rights. There's an opportunity for responsibility to be taken. There's a few of these ideas being thrown around about building bridges to people and saying, well, we tried talking to them, they wouldn't listen, so we'll stop there. How far should we go in order to be able to bring some unity, do you think? I mean, it's the same with that example of involving that middle group, but then I hear people saying, yeah, this is what we want in a society, but then they'll finish up by saying, and if you don't like it, then leave. It doesn't feel like it's going far enough. What's your thought?
well, when it comes down to it, there are some people, as we've said already, who you may never convince.
Yeah.
What you need to do is provide pathways for people to take an alternative path. So rather than people running off, say for instance, to be radicalised, or people running off to become part of the UPF or however you want it, they see something as an alternative that gives them an investment in our society, an investment in our community. And so how much effort should you put into that? It's a constant process. It doesn't end. There'll be this issue today, there'll be another issue tomorrow, there'll be one after that. So long as our society keeps evolving, and particularly in a multicultural, multi-faith society, it will go on unendingly. And that is in itself not a bad thing, because we're constantly evaluating who we are. We don't need to do that in a way that's completely morally relativist. We need to preserve and protect the existing institutions and values which have served our country so well, while looking at how we adapt in a time of change. Because technology is just much playing a significant contributor to this discussion as anything else. And I can tell you, that isn't going to slow down. So how much more emphasis you put into it, you should put unending emphasis as part of what you need to do. But that is a constant process. That's all I would say. Yeah.
Okay, last question, and then Tim.
Mine's not actually more of a comment than a question.
Sure.
I actually sympathise with the opposers, the mosque. I'm actually from a Muslim background. I'm not a practicing Muslim, but my family are.
Yep.
Because I think that for the last few years, I think our previous Prime Minister has a lot to answer for. He created a society of fear with the type of language that he used. And I think that this has culminated in groups such as the UPM that are actually spreading, and they continue to spread that fear. The things I've heard, the things my son is coming home and telling me that he's hearing from friends, parents, that it's just continues. But what I'm hoping for now is with this change of Prime Minister that the language will change and that we'll start to see a bit more subtlety in the way we treat our arrivals to Australia and not use that illegal language and the type of punitive ways that we've been treating people.
Okay, there's a lot of issues you've conflated all as part of the same discussion. You said a comment, but I'm going to provide a quick response, which is why I come back to what I said before, which is the importance of tone. And I agree with you that the tone has not always been helpful or conducive. But I also go back to some of the issues that somebody raised before about the fact that we can't also turn a blind eye to the reality of what happens when people use a particular faith to express themselves in horrific ways and be radicalised and prey on others to be able to go about committing horrific acts. And it's absolutely...
That's happened throughout any religion.
I'm not arguing that point out. I'm not disagreeing with you on that. But that's why nuance and tone matters. And I agree with you. And that's why, according to what I've heard, your local leadership is doing that well. And I hope to see more people do it as well. But equally, everybody in this room has a responsibility to that discussion as well. Because when it comes down to it, we have to create the community that we want. Leadership plays a part, and they do have a big influence in terms of setting the tone. But sitting behind that is what we need to do with that and send a message to them about whether we think that tone is reflecting who we are and who we want to be as a nation. Apparently that was